My name is Renee Coates, and I'm 36 years old. 4 weeks ago, in a probate courtroom in Asheville, North Carolina, my older sister stood up in a black dress she bought for the occasion and told a judge that our dying father never wanted me to have a single dollar of his estate. My mother sat behind her and dabbed her eyes with a tissue she didn't need. I sat at the far end of the table with my hands folded and let my sister finish every single word. I didn't interrupt. Then my attorney reached into a plain brown folder and slid one document across the table, face down, and asked the judge if he could take a short recess before he read it. What that document said, and what my sister did the moment she realized what it was, is the reason my family no longer speaks at Thanksgiving. Welcome back to Quiet Storm Confessions, where women who were told to stay silent finally hand the microphone to themselves. If you've ever been called selfish for simply asking what was already yours, this story is for you. Drop a comment when you get to the part with the storage unit, and subscribe, because you are not going to believe how my sister's own greed became the evidence that buried her. To understand what happened in that courtroom, I need to take you back 11 months, to the night my father, Walter Coates, was rushed to Mission Hospital with chest pain that turned out to be the beginning of the end. I got the call at 11:40 p.m. on a Tuesday. I was folding my daughter's laundry when my phone lit up with my mother's name, and I knew before I answered that nothing about that call was going to be small. My father had built a modest but steady life. 41 years running Coates Hardware and Supply on Depot Street, a shop that smelled like sawdust and motor oil, and had a bell above the door that still rang the same way it did when I was 7 years old sitting on a paint bucket doing my homework while he worked the register. He wasn't a wealthy man in the way people mean when they say wealthy, but he was careful, and careful adds up. A paid-off house on Larkspur Lane, a small rental property he'd bought in the 90s for almost nothing. Some retirement savings he never touched. And the business itself, which he'd been slowly winding down for 2 years, selling off inventory, letting the lease run out, preparing, I would later understand, for something he already knew was coming. My sister Danielle is 4 years older than me and has spent most of her adult life either needing something from our parents or making sure everyone remembered how much she'd sacrificed for them. She moved back into their house when her second marriage ended, and she never quite moved back out. For 6 years, she lived in the downstairs bedroom, paid no rent, and told anyone who asked that she was taking care of Dad, which was true in the sense that she occasionally drove him to appointments and untrue in the sense that our mother did all of it, every day, while Danielle worked part-time at a salon and posted vacation photos from trips our parents somehow always ended up paying for. I never lived in that house as an adult. I got married at 24, had my daughter Mia at 28, and built a life 40 minutes away in Fletcher with my husband, Cole, who installs HVAC systems and works harder than anyone I have ever met. I visited every Sunday. I brought my father soup when he had the flu. I sat with him in the hospital the night he had his gallbladder removed, while Danielle texted from a nail appointment asking if I could keep her posted. None of that mattered to my family's version of events, because in my family, presents didn't count. Only performance counted, and Danielle performed devotion the way other people perform in a play, loudly, publicly, and only when there was an audience. My father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in October. He was given, at best, a year. He took that year, and he spent it the way he'd spent every year of his life, quietly, methodically, and without telling anyone more than they needed to know. What none of us knew, what I didn't find out until it was almost too late to matter, was that in November, 6 weeks after his diagnosis, my father drove himself to a law office on Charlotte Street and sat down with an estate attorney named Priya Anand. He told her he wanted to update his will. He told her exactly why. He said, and this is a sentence I would later hear read out loud in a courtroom in a voice that made the walls feel smaller, "My daughter Renee is the only one of my children who never once asked me for anything. I want to make sure that means something before I'm gone. That will left the rental property and 60% of his liquid assets to me. It left the house on Larkspur Lane, which he knew my mother needed to live in, to my mother for her lifetime use, after which it would pass T. O both Danielle and me equally. And it left Danielle 40% of the remaining assets, which was still a substantial amount of money, more than enough to matter, just not equal to what I was getting, because as he put it in his own handwriting on a legal pad Priya Anand kept in his file, equal isn't always fair, and fair is what I'm after. He signed that will on November 14th. he had it properly witnessed. He had a doctor confirm, in writing, that he was of sound mind, specifically because he told Priya Anand he knew exactly how his older daughter would react, and he wanted no room for anyone to say otherwise later. He was right to worry. He just didn't live long enough to see how right he was. My father passed away in March. At home, in the bed my mother had moved into the front room so he could see the dogwood tree in the yard bloom one more time. I was holding his hand. Danielle was not in the house. She arrived 40 minutes after he was gone, having stopped, I later learned, to get her nails redone for the viewing that hadn't even been scheduled yet. I'm telling you that detail not to be cruel, but because it is the truest possible summary of who my sister has always been, a woman who plans her appearance before she plans her presence. The funeral was small and dignified, the way my father would have wanted it. For about 3 weeks after that, things were almost peaceful. Grief has a way of pausing certain kinds of cruelty, at least temporarily. Then the estate attorney called both of us in for the reading of the will, and peace ended the moment Priya Anand finished the second paragraph. Danielle's face did something I will remember for the rest of my life. It went perfectly still, the way water goes still right before it starts to boil. She didn't cry. She didn't say anything at first. She simply looked at me across that conference table with an expression I had seen exactly twice before in my life, once when I got a full scholarship she didn't get, and once when I got engaged before she did. It was the look of someone recalculating in real time how much of the story they were allowed to control. She said, very calmly, that this had to be a mistake, that our father would never have done this, that I must have influenced him somehow while he was sick and vulnerable, that everyone knew I had always been the favorite, and clearly I had finally cashed that in. I sat there with my hands folded and let her finish every sentence. I didn't argue. Priya Anand, to her enormous credit, simply slid a folder across the table and said, "The will speaks for itself, and so does the medical capacity letter attached to it, dated the same day." Danielle didn't even look at it. She stood up, said she'd be contesting it, and walked out of that office so fast she left her sunglasses on the table. I picked them up. I still have them. I don't know why I kept them. Maybe some part of me already knew I'd need a small, stupid piece of evidence that I was the one who stayed calm in that room. What followed over the next several weeks was a masterclass in what my mother used to call, back when I was a teenager, and it applied to different things, working the room. Danielle didn't come at me directly. She came at everyone around me. She called my aunts. She called my father's 2 remaining sisters, both in their 70s, and told them a version of events in which I had visited our father alone in his final months, specifically to get him talking about money, while he was on pain medication. She called family friends and cried on the phone about how she'd given up her 20s and 30s taking care of our parents, while I ran off and had my perfect little family, which was a curious way to describe getting married and holding a steady job 40 minutes from where I grew up. She posted, on a private Facebook group for our extended family, a long paragraph about grief and betrayal that never named me directly but didn't need to, because everyone in that group knew exactly who she meant. My cousin Bates sent me a screenshot with the message, "Is this true?" And I sat at my kitchen table reading it, while my daughter did homework 6 feet away. And I understood, the way you understand weather changing before the first drop falls, that I was about to spend the next several months defending a version of my own life to people who had never once asked me a single question directly. My mother, for her part, did what my mother has always done, which is nothing, gently. She didn't defend me and she didn't attack me. She occupied a soft, permanent middle ground where she'd say things like, "I just want you girls to work this out, and your father wouldn't have wanted a fight." As if the will hadn't already settled what he wanted in his own handwriting, notarized and witnessed. 6 weeks after a doctor confirmed, he understood exactly what he was signing. I asked her once, directly, sitting in her kitchen with 2 cups of coffee goy. And G cold, whether she believed I had manipulated Dad. She looked at her hands and said, "I don't think you meant to. I want you to sit with that sentence the way I had to sit with it. Not I don't think you did it. Not I know you didn't. I don't think you meant to." As if influence were a spill instead of a decision. As if 40 years of showing up quietly could be waved away by 4 months of somebody else showing up loudly, after the fact, with better timing and a louder voice. I finished my coffee, thanked her, and drove home in silence. And that was the drive where I decided I would stop trying to convince the people who had already decided what story they wanted to believe. Danielle filed her formal will contest in April, through a lawyer named Garrett Voss, whose retainer, I would later find out from Priya Anand, my mother had quietly helped pay, because she just wants this settled, apparently meant funding the person actively trying to overturn our father's dying wishes. The petition claimed lack of testamentary capacity and undue influence, the two classic legal weapons people use when they can't accept that a parent simply loved one child's steadiness more than another child's noise. The petition described our father as confused, medicated, and isolated in his final months, cut off from Danielle by my supposed interference, easily swayed by whoever happened to be in the room. It described me, in language clearly written by a lawyer trying to make a jury dislike me, as having engineered a pattern of increased and suspicious contact with our father in the period surrounding the new will. My increased and suspicious contact was Sunday dinners and grocery runs, and sitting with him during chemotherapy, none of which Danielle had been present for because she was, according to her own social media, in Charleston for a girls' weekend the exact week the new will was signed. I want to tell you that reading that petition didn't hurt. It did. It is one specific kind of pain to watch someone rewrite your love for your dying father into a legal strategy, and I sat in my car in the parking lot outside my attorney's office and cried for 11 minutes before I went inside, and then I wiped my face, walked in, and asked what we needed to do to win. My attorney's name is Marissa Okonkwo, and her office is above a bakery on Merriman Avenue that always smells like cinnamon, which felt almost cruelly gentle for the kind of conversations we had up there. She read the petition twice, tapped the page with 2 fingers, and said, "Your sister's whole case rests on painting your father as a confused old man who didn't know what he was doing." That's a very specific claim to make about someone who had a doctor sign off on his capacity the same day he signed the will, in writing, at the request of the man himself. She asked me to walk her through every visit, every conversation, everything I remembered from those last 6 months. I told her about the soup, the chemo appointments, the Sunday dinners, and then, almost as an afterthought, I mentioned something I hadn't thought mattered until I said it out loud. In December, my father had asked me to help him go through some boxes in a storage unit off Sweeten Creek Road, a unit he'd rented years earlier and never told either of us much about. He said he wanted his affairs in order and wanted my help sorting through old paperwork before he got too tired to do it himself. Marissa sat forward so fast her coffee nearly tipped. "Did you go through everything in that unit?" she asked. I told her we'd gone through most of it, but there were 2 boxes near the back we hadn't finished. Boxes he said were just old business stuff that he wanted to deal with another day, a day that never came because 3 weeks later he was admitted to the hospital and never came home again. Marissa looked at me for a long moment and said the sentence that changed the entire direction of this case. "Renee, do you still have access to that unit?" I did. I had never given up the key because nobody had ever asked me to, and honestly, going through it alone felt like something I wasn't ready to do. That weekend, with Cole beside me and a box of tissues on the dashboard, I drove to that storage unit for the first time since my father died. It smelled like cardboard and dust, and 40 years of a man who never threw anything away that might someday be useful. In the second of those 2 unfinished boxes, underneath a stack of old hardware store invoices, I found a manila folder labeled, in my father's careful block handwriting, the same handwriting he used to write price tags for 41 years. 4 later, important. Inside that folder were bank statements going back 6 years. And in those statements, highlighted in yellow by my father's own hand, were a series of transfers, some small, some not so small, from his personal checking account to Danielle's checking account, dated across nearly the entire period she had lived in that house, supposedly taking care of him for free. $22,000 over 4 years, in amounts ranging from $400 to $3,000, always described in the memo line, in his handwriting on his own copies of the check stubs, the same 3 words, over and over. Danielle again, loan. Beneath the bank statements was something else. A single page, typed, unsigned, dated the same week he signed his new will, that read like a private note to himself, the kind of thing a careful man writes when he wants to remember exactly why he did what he did. It said that he had decided to leave Danielle less because he had, quote, already given her more than she will ever admit to, and I am tired of pretending those $22,000 were rent she paid in kindness instead of money I gave her because I am her father and I love her, even when I am disappointed in her. He wrote that Renee had never once asked him for a dollar in her adult life, not even when Cole was between jobs for 4 months, and they were behind on their mortgage, a detail I hadn't even realized he knew about, because I had never told him. He must have noticed. He must have quietly watched his younger daughter struggle in silence and never ask, while his older daughter asked constantly and never struggled in silence at all. He wrote in the last line of that page, "This isn't about who loved me more. It's about who let me be their father instead of their bank." I sat on the concrete floor of that storage unit and read that page 4 times, and then I called Marissa, and I could hear in her voice that she understood immediately what we were holding. "This isn't just evidence he had capacity," she said. "This is evidence of exactly why he made the choice he made, in his own words, dated the same week as the will, completely independent of anything you said or did. Renee, this doesn't just defend the will. This unravels her entire case." I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't triumph, not yet. It was grief, sharpened into something almost unbearable, because my father had spent the last months of his life quietly documenting his own daughter's dishonesty, alone, in a storage unit, telling no one, protecting Danielle's image right up until the moment he protected the truth instead. I thought about calling her. I thought about driving straight to my mother's house and putting that folder on the kitchen table and asking both of them to explain the $22,000 my sister had spent 6 months publicly claiming didn't exist, the sacrifice she made caring for our parents for free. I didn't do either of those things. Instead, I did what my father would have done. I made a copy of everything, put the originals in a safe deposit box, and gave the copies to my lawyer, and I let the legal process, the same quiet, careful process he had trusted, do what it was built to do. If you have ever watched someone rewrite the story of your family and felt powerless to stop it because you didn't have the words yet, stay with me, because this is the part where the words finally arrived, and they weren't even mine. They were his. Tell me in the comments if you've ever found out a hidden truth about someone in a box they left behind, and make sure you're subscribed, because my sister was about to take the stand and swear to a story that was already dead in a folder she didn't know existed. The hearing was set for late July, in a courtroom on College Street with tall windows and a portrait of some long-dead judge watching over everything with an expression of permanent disapproval that felt, honestly, appropriate. Danielle arrived in a soft gray dress, subdued, respectful, exactly the visual language of a grieving daughter who had been wronged. My mother sat behind her, tissue ready. My father's 2 sisters sat a row back, having been convinced, weeks earlier, that I had somehow manipulated a dying man out of what was rightfully theirs to witness, and I watched their faces as they looked at me, and I understood that some of that damage might never fully undo itself, and I made peace with that on the drive there, because I could not control what my aunts believed, only what was true. Danielle testified first. Garrett Voss walked her gently through a story I had heard pieces of for months, but never all at once, all under oath, all on the record. She described our father as increasingly confused in his final year. She described herself as his primary caregiver, unpaid, devoted, having put her own life on hold. She described me as a distant daughter who swooped in, once the diagnosis came, suddenly interested in a relationship she implied I had neglected for years. She said, and I remember this exact sentence, because it was so far from anything resembling my actual life that I almost laughed out loud, "I gave up everything for my father, and I never once asked him for anything in return." On cross-examination, Marissa asked exactly 3 questions, slowly letting each answer sit in the air before moving to the next. "Ms. Coates, in the 4 years prior to your father's death, did you receive any money from him?" Danielle's chin lifted, the exact same gesture I'd watched her make since we were children whenever she was about to say something untrue with total confidence. "No, never. I never took a dime from my father." "Take your time," Marissa said. "Any transfers at all, gifts, loans, anything?" "Nothing. I have never asked my father for money in my life." And then Marissa asked the 3rd question, the one she'd built the entire cross-examination toward. "If bank records showed $22,000 transferred from your father's account to yours over the past 4 years, with memo lines in his handwriting, how would you explain that?" Danielle's face did the thing it did in Priya Annan's office, the going still before boiling thing, and she said, too fast, "That would be a mistake. Or it's fabricated. I don't know what you're talking about." My mother, behind her, went very pale. Marissa approached the bench. She asked the judge for permission to enter the folder into evidence, the bank statements, the highlighted transfers, my father's unsigned note in his own handwriting, all of it certified copies, sourced from a storage unit he had personally shown me, months before he died, specifically so that someday, if it ever needed to be found, it would be. The judge reviewed the documents in silence for what felt like several minutes, the kind of silence where you can hear the air conditioning and nothing else. Then he looked up, not at Marissa, at Danielle, and he read the amounts back to her, one by one, dates and figures, in a flat, even voice that somehow made it worse than shouting could have. He asked her again, under oath, whether she had received money from her father. This time she didn't say no. She said quietly that those were loans, not gifts, and loans don't count. Which was not a legal distinction anyone in that room found persuasive, least of all the judge, who noted for the record that no loan documentation existed anywhere, only your father's own handwritten memo lines describing them as loans he clearly never expected repaid. Then he asked to see the unsigned note, the one about who let him be their father instead of their bank, and he read it once, silently, and set it down, and said, in the same even voice, "This document, dated the same week as the will and independently corroborated by financial records the petitioner just testified did not exist, speaks directly to the decedent's state of mind and his reasoning. It does not suggest confusion. It suggests clarity." He looked at Danielle for a long moment and said, "Ms. Coates, I would encourage you to consider very carefully whether continuing this contest serves your interests," which is judge language, I've since learned, for you have already lost, and everyone in this room knows it, including you. Garrett Voss asked for a recess. The judge granted 10 minutes. Danielle didn't look at me on her way out of the courtroom, and I understood, the way I'd understood it in Priya Annan's office months earlier, that some people cannot look directly at a mirror once it's been placed in front of them with a court seal on it. When we came back, Voss withdrew the contest. Not because Danielle wanted to, I don't think, but because there was nothing left standing to fight for. The will was upheld in full. My father's wishes, the ones he wrote down alone, carefully, in his own handwriting, in a room nobody else knew he was sitting in, were honored exactly as he intended them. I did not feel like celebrating. I felt like I'd watched my sister be handed a mirror she'd spent her whole life avoiding, and I felt, more than anything, exhausted, the specific exhaustion of having spent 5 months defending a love that should never have needed defending in the first place. In the hallway afterward, my aunts approached me, and I watched them decide, visibly, in real time, which version of this story they were going to carry forward. One of them hugged me and apologized. The other one simply said, "Well, I suppose the numbers speak for themselves," which is not quite an apology but is, from her, close enough that I accepted it. My mother found me by the elevators. She didn't apologize either, not really, but she said something I've turned over in my mind every day since. She said, "I always thought I was keeping the peace." I told her that keeping the peace and keeping the truth buried are not always the same thing, and sometimes the second one only feels like the first one if you're the person who benefits from the silence. She didn't have a response to that. I don't think she'd ever had to develop one before. Here is the ledger, 3 weeks out. The rental property is mine, the way my father intended. My Mo. Her still lives in the house on Larkspur Lane, and I still visit every Sunday, though those visits are quieter now, more honest, less performed. Danielle and I have not spoken since the hearing. She sent one text 2 weeks after that said only "hope you're happy," which is, I think, the closest she has ever come to an apology and also the furthest thing from one, both at once, which is very much who she has always been. I didn't respond. Not out of cruelty, but because I finally understood something my father must have understood long before I did, sitting alone in that storage unit, quietly building a case he hoped he'd never need. Some relationships end not with a slammed door, but with a very calm, very final silence, the kind you choose instead of the kind that's forced on you. I kept my father's unsigned note. I had it framed, small, simple, and I keep it in a drawer in my desk, not on display, because it was never meant for an audience, it was meant for the truth, and I think that's exactly where it belongs. Every so often I take it out and read the last line again. This isn't about who loved me more. It's about who let me be their father instead of their bank. I think about that sentence more than almost anything else he ever said to me because it wasn't really about money at all. It was about the difference between showing up because you love someone and showing up because you want something, and how much a quiet, careful man notices that difference, even when everyone around him assumes he's too tired, too sick, too confused to see it clearly. If this story reminded you that quiet devotion counts even when nobody's applauding for it, that the people who show up without asking for anything are often the ones who are truly seen, take that as your sign today. Write things down. Keep your receipts, your records, your proof, not because you expect to need them, but because someday someone you trust might need them for you. If someone you love has ever had their steady, quiet love overlooked in favor of someone louder, share this with them. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.